Thank you. I'm really happy to be here because we were asked to talk about our work on disease in New York City. And both Naomi and I have worked on studies of disease in New York City. Mine first is about diphtheria. So I have, I want to tell a story about the history of diphtheria and the control of diphtheria in New York City. My slides are a bit text heavy, and I'm just going to kind of skim, and I hope it just generates lots of questions, and then I can fill in a lot of the blanks. So I'm going to share my screen and begin. I hope you can see that. Let me know if that's not working right. Okay. Slideshow. And that's, oh, whoops. Okay, hold on. There we go. Okay, so diphtheria in New York City, 1880 to 1930. So the first thing I want to tell you about is a little bit about diphtheria itself. Can you see those slides okay? All right. So in modern terms, it's defined as an acute infectious disease caused by a bacillus, Corynebacterium diphtheriae, as many people know it. Many med students know it as that. The bacillus occurs in three major types, and they associated, the most severe type is associated with high case fatality. And then there's also a milder type, which is associated with mild infections. It usually enters the body through the upper respiratory tract, mainly via droplets or infected persons, secretions from the nose. And also, most importantly, which I hope we can talk a lot about tonight, or from the healthy throats of people who acquired the bacilli from being in contact with the germs. And that plays a major issue. That becomes a major issue in the control of diphtheria. And so you get clinical manifestations 1 to 7 days after you're exposed. And also it produces a local inflammatory lesion across the throat, across the larynx, which is called a pseudomembrane. And that starts reducing a toxin into the system. And so death can occur from the way the pseudomembrane closes off the throat, or it can result from the effects of the toxin. Today, in most countries of the world, there's really widespread immunization with children with toxin endotoxin. Many of you listening will remember having to take your diphtheria shots before you go to school. And that is a key aspect of what it means to bring a disease under control. So now, actually, if more than 2 or 3 cases of diphtheria break out in the community, it's called an epidemic. I would actually say if you took a child into the hospital this afternoon with the kind of symptoms, a sore throat, some beginning of some lesions across the throat, most of the people who would be examining the child would know what it was, because few practitioners actually have seen it. And then, of course, not all the strains of diphtheria are highly toxic. And so one of the things that's happened now is we have a very large adult population that hasn't been immunized since they were kids, that are only partially immunized. So if the more toxic strain was more present in our communities, a lot of people would have diphtheria, which is not what we want. Okay, it's been known since colonial times as a virulent epidemic disease of children. It was particularly difficult to diagnose and to treat. And during the 19th century, the crude death rate from this disease rose to a rate approximately equal to that of some cancers today. In 1857, there was a very virulent epidemic that swept across Europe and America. In 1890, it was a leading cause of death in many cities, with almost 2,000 deaths among children under 15 in New York City alone. But then by 1900, diphtheria accounted for over 5% of total deaths among this age group in the US, and more than 200,000 cases were reported as late as 1921. But at the beginning of the 20th century, the New York State Department of Health reported 3,200 deaths from the disease. And it's sort of endemic in many cities, with occasional cases popping up through the year, and also sometimes with periods where there are outbreaks of a particular severity, especially in rural places. My screen isn't changing. Okay, let's see if I can do that better. It's not happy. There you go. So one of the comments that was made about diphtheria in the 19th century and the 1880s, that it was believed by many prominent physicians that smallpox was the paradigmatic infectious disease of the 19th century and many centuries actually. And so many physicians thought we ought to be able to control any kind of infectious disease, just like we control smallpox. But the other thing they talk about is that we have to deal with some of the environmental conditions that cause the diphtheria bacillus to breed. And they talked about the need to have clean water supplies, to clean up surroundings of many tenement buildings here in New York City. The ways in which those are in low-lying areas where there would be floods from the rivers, and they were entering in the houses, especially in the tenement houses. People lived in those apartments. And that the streets need to be cleaned of garbage. And people needed to be isolated from contagious disease. And people needed to have, people who lived in poor, crowded living conditions. They needed to have a place to take their children. And also there needed to be careful medical supervision of the public schools. As I was putting this slide deck together, I'm thinking, oh my goodness, we really are talking about issues that are really quite prevalent for us today. So it was a disease, an infectious, contagious disease that manifested largely in young children. As I said, it resembled a sore throat. And then you have the cases due to the blockage, due to the pseudomembrane. And in the 19th century, it was typically characterized by its symptoms. And so it was difficult to diagnose, it was difficult to treat, no cure was available, and it was difficult to recognize because the symptoms were so similar to other inflammations of the throat. And so, I mean, one of the things I think is really important to remember about this particular disease is that along with other diseases, infectious diseases, no one in that world at the time thought that the world could be free of infectious and contagious diseases. They thought this was part of the world that you would always have to live with. So the problem that diphtheria presented was a complex one. The mortality rate was high, especially among young children. No specific therapy existed for it until the introduction of antitoxin in the last decade of the 19th century. Its mode of transmission was unclear. The prevention of it was less than effective until large numbers of children were actively immunized at the end of the 1920s. And you can just look at this old chart that tells you in 1887, there were in New York City, Manhattan and the Bronx, you have 5,923 cases, 3,000 deaths. And then you look at moving down, if you look at 1894, you have almost 10,000 cases, but only 2,870 deaths. And then 1895, it's a spike, 10,000. 1896, 11,000. 10,000 again in 1897. And then the numbers of cases start falling. And then in 1902, you have another 10,000, right? But the numbers of deaths continue to fall. And that's because of the intervention of antitoxin and beginning to use immunization. So I just want to say a minute about the burden of disease. These striking figures about diphtheria are important, but we also have to remember in the state of New York alone, there were deaths, really serious deaths from scarlet fever, from typhoid, from measles, from meningitis, from malarial diseases. We still had smallpox. And the biggest, and 9,000 cases of diarrheal diseases, which was really had to do with the bad water, food, et cetera. And 14,000 cases of tuberculosis. And there was little that could be done for these people. And these outbreaks of infectious diseases were very frightening to the public. The public was highly fearful of such outbreaks. Quarantine and isolation of the sick were in reality the only really useful tools that physicians and public health had at their disposal. These practices were widely resisted by the public. Imagine what happened is your house, your apartment would be placarded with this in this household, there's diphtheria. In this household next door there's tuberculosis. So you'd be marked, it's a stigma. And most families didn't want their houses placarded, of course. And if your house was placarded, then the public health department could come, remove all your furniture, take it to this place where they would fumigate it. And the thing that came with fumigation was pretty much destruction of your furniture. And then brought back, or sometimes, and many times, children, if the house was too densely packed with too many people, children could be removed from their homes and taken to the hospital. Hospitals were not a great place to be in those days. And so the population of New York were used to time after time, summer after summer, year after year of outbreaks of some of these diseases I've just named. And so outbreaks where there were big spikes was something that was highly, highly feared. So New York City and the control of diphtheria, I'm trying to talk fast, but I'll try to slow down a little bit. It was the first infectious disease to be controlled by scientific medicine, particularly by discoveries in bacteriology and immunology. The work in bacteriology led to the development of the antitoxin, which was awarded the first Nobel Prize in medicine. And by the 1930s, it had become the paradigmatic disease of the bacteriological revolution and the symbol of the triumph of medicine in the control of infectious disease. So at that point, people said, we know how to control infectious diseases. And there's a long period where there's few outbreaks like what existed in the the long 19th century and the early 20th century. So it was a moment where science could assert its authority, and people believed they had brought these diseases under control. The New York City Health Department was crucial, critical to this issue. They were the first first public health department to use the information and from bacteriology. They started the first bacteriological diagnosis program in 1893, and the first distribution of diphtheria antitoxin for treatment, and then toxin antitoxin for immunization. And also they made other fundamental discoveries as well. So one of the things that I wanted to say is that it's again, I just want to keep reminding you, there's a lot of infectious disease around. And the expectation for most people, was that there's something going to be happening all the time. They didn't have the sense that we have now, having gone past that period, in that these outbreaks, like the COVID, are unusual, unexpected, and we don't, and unsettling in different ways. So when the antitoxin was first discovered and invented, I should say, this was on the front page of the New York Times. Sure cure for diphtheria, Dr. Koch is discoverer and antitoxin is named. Its experiment, it has been proved to be almost, if not quite, infallible when given in early stages of the disease. And it's made from blood of animals inoculated with diphtheria and poison, but it's costly, has been tried in this city. This was front page news to find a treatment for diphtheria in New York City, and went around the world. This is 1894. And the following underneath that headline, it says, the New York Times wrote, diphtheria would have lost all its terrors if what the New York City Health Department says shall prove to be reliable. It will no longer be one of the most dreaded of disease. It will be reduced to one of the most ordinary ailments. And that hope, and that is clear there. There had not been a lot of public discussion of diphtheria before the antitoxin was available, because it was just one among those many long lists of infections that New York City residents had to deal with. The next big push happens when we start talking about when immunization is made available in the 1920s, and there's a lot of stuff jumping from antitoxin to immunization, there's a lot I can't cover, but here's, I think, a wonderful picture of what happened in schools. When children were being brought in every day, notice the short haircuts, and the students lined up to get their immunization shots. And so the support for this was very high. And the last thing I want to say is, though, the support was high, but there are crucial issues that we have to remember about what brought it under control in New York City, and it has to do with these two. When antitoxin was first discovered to be an effective treatment, there was a lot of push on the part of the public health experts to make it free to the poor of New York City. That was crucial. And in New York City, politics is always really complicated. But those who were in control at the time, Tammany Hall says, oh, saving babies. If we give them this medicine, we'll be saving babies. That's a good idea for us. That's a way for us to win with the public. And so providing antitoxin for treatment for free for the poor was one of the things that they championed. When antitoxin was available for immunization, same thing. Let's save some more babies. There's a lot of resistance on the part of the public who said, now wait a minute, what, my kid's not sick, and you want us to give us this thing, this drug, and that doesn't work for us. A lot of parents were resistant. A lot of male parents were resistant because some of them had gotten immunized in World War I in camps. And adults typically had more side effects and reactions to the antitoxin than babies did. But the fathers came home and said, no, you're not doing that to my baby. I was sick. And I know people who got bad rashes and allergic reactions and all this kind of thing. So fathers were really resistant to doing this. But the city came together, and you could find out about diphtheria immunizations on every media in New York City and in every spoken language in the city. So public health and government work together in a very powerful way to make it clear that something that is brand new in the world, immunizations, treatments based on something called bacteriology, which a whole generation of physicians in the city didn't really know anything about. It was very abstract to them. But it was made concrete in very innovative ways. And because at the end you could link it to saving babies, had a powerful effect on the public. And the scientists, bacteriologists, public health experts, and physicians who became leaders in the effort were very, very strong and tightly knit group that were able to really create innovative ways to fight back the resistance that some physicians had, the skepticisms of families and parents, and the resistance of some politicians who thought maybe this was moving a little too fast. But at the end of the day, this generation of public health experts and physicians really set the stage for the support of the use of scientifically based, evidence-based public health practice in the control of infectious disease. And as this last quote that I love so much says, the reduction of the death rate is the principal statistical expression and index of human social progress. It means saving and lengthening the lives of thousands of citizens, the extension of the vigorous working period well into old age, and the prevention of inefficiency, misery, and suffering. These advances can be made by organized social effort because public health is purchasable. And sometimes you look back and say, oh, look how naive they were. But you know, their belief and their implementation of this kind of approach actually did bring a very highly virulent, very serious and fatal disease that killed thousands and thousands of children. It did bring it under control. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Evelynn. Let me begin by sharing my screen. Okay, so I'm going to begin at a moment when all of these infectious diseases that Evelynn was discussing were starting to get better. And you start to see a decline in the number of tuberculosis and typhoid fever, diphtheria, other than these outbreaks that she's describing, smallpox and so on. And so here are just two graphs that show you that, generally speaking, other than the very dramatic moment of the influenza pandemic of 1918, infectious disease started to be seen as something that society had a handle on, that children were being brought up healthier, parents understood what good nutrition and good sanitation, good hygiene was. There was increasing regulation of housing and workforces, so that all of these things together actually were starting to make a difference in the picture around infectious disease, but not for polio. And polio is a very disruptive, epidemic polio, a very disruptive disease. By 1916, and you can see this spike here over to the left, because not only did you start to see outbreaks where before there had been nothing, but in fact it got worse. Mm-hmm. So it was actually, these are examples that are completely counter to all the other really progressive and optimistic expectations about control over your environment. And let me just say that this was disruptive, especially this for the public. It was a very scary disease, although as you can see with the red line, it's not generally a disease that causes a lot of deaths. But what it does is it paralyzes, especially children. And public health officials were very disturbed by this. So polio epidemics first appear in some Scandinavian countries and then in North America, and by the 1920s, so after the major epidemic I'm going to talk about of 1916, was pretty much a disease of most of the Western world. And one of the things you see in reaction to it are quite sort of traditional responses by both the public and many public health officials. One of the reasons that this was seen as such a terrifying disease, even though compared to the cases and deaths of most other infectious disease, it was pretty small, is that it paralyzed children. And this fear of crippling was a really profound issue, especially when disability meant deformity. It meant a feeling that children would never be able to join society as full citizens. And so it was seen as a really terrifying disease, even if it didn't kill a large number of people. So here's examples of what the epidemic in 1916 looks like. You can see from the part of the map of the United States, that this was primarily a northeastern epidemic, although there were outbreaks in some other states. And here I'm just going to mainly talk about New York City, which was really the epicenter of the 1916 epidemic. 8,900 cases, 2,400 deaths. It was, as you can see here, and this was true for much of polio's epidemic history, a summer disease. It occurred, you started to see cases sometime in early June, and then it got rapidly worse. And then as the fall came, it gradually disappeared. And there were lots and lots of theories about why that would be. One of the things that we know from 1916, and this was true for later epidemics as well, is it was front page news. Newspapers showed the numbers of cases, and every day you could trace where they were, how many cases, and how many people had died. Now, of course, people wanted to know why, where did it come from, who was spreading it, and the health commissioner, the senior health official of New York City, Haven Emerson, shared a general belief that the probable carriers of polio, and it's possible that also these were people who had originated polio in the city, were immigrants. And so when there was a doctor's child, and here let me just sort of translate that as an Anglo-white middle-class doctor's child who had got the disease and then died of it, Emerson argued that it was not the result of the father, even though he was a physician and could potentially have brought the disease home to the family, but it was much more likely that the child's Polish nurse, an immigrant woman, had been the probable carrier. Now, of the many, many theories of disease, especially to try to explain its distinct epidemiological picture of emerging in the summer and disappearing in the fall, there were many, many theories here. I'm just listing vast numbers of them. Perhaps the most popular was that it was spread by an insect. Insects were a very cool and modern way of understanding health issues. There were a number of exciting discoveries in the late 19th and early 20th century. Malaria, yellow fever, for example. There was, it made a lot of sense to think about maybe mosquitoes, particularly flies. You see here flies being blamed for a whole range of infectious diseases. But primarily the focus was on immigrants. The first child identified to have polio paralysis lived in an Italian neighborhood in Brooklyn, and then there was an outbreak amongst Italian families not far from there. Health officials immediately went to Italian neighborhoods, nailing quarantine signs on the doors, and then they developed a whole series of pamphlets. You see one here, and they gave them to households and families in tenements across Brooklyn and Lower Manhattan, and they were in many, many languages, reflecting the idea that what you needed is that families needed to understand what they needed to do, how to keep their children safe, how to keep their houses more hygienic. So profound was this notion that somehow maybe it was something about Italy, maybe it was something about immigrants, that the mayor of New York City actually contacted the the US embassy in Italy to ask whether there were outbreaks in Italy, and there were not. In fact, outbreaks in Italy. But that was sort of the theory that maybe immigrants had come through Ellis Island secretly bringing this disease. So it was a terrifying moment. And parents and children who could afford to leave the city fled the city. And in response, there were many regions around New York City, all the way up to the north of Massachusetts and Philadelphia, where officials said, oh no, we're not having these infected children entering our towns, and they turned them away. As a result of that, a number of states and also the Federal Public Health Service began to offer exit certificates or health certificates to state that the child was polio free, although not all officials even said that that was enough. But here's an example of a public health service certificate that would have been given to a child. This was particularly important in some places like Philadelphia, where children maybe lived in New Jersey and crossed over to Philadelphia to work in Philadelphia and had to prove that they didn't have polio so that they could be let in. What you see is a city lockdown. Children were barred from public spaces like theaters and libraries and ball games. A whole range of family events were canceled by the public health department. And particularly ones that were seen as more likely to involve immigrants. So circuses, Italian saints festivals, and so on. A number of playgrounds were closed, and some that were not closed had their sand pits disinfected, right, so that the children would be playing presumably in clean sand. There were many wealthy families outside Lower Manhattan worried that immigrants' children were bringing the polio epidemic to them, and they contacted the police to try to have them fine those children or fine their families. But in fact, they ended up having a number of cases in, for example, Oyster Bay on Long Island, very few of them in immigrant children, more often in Anglo middle class children. So here's an example of the kinds of things that would be stuck on your wall or on your door. New York City also had very strict quarantine regulations, and most immigrant families who lived in crowded circumstances could not possibly achieve them. And so it's not surprising that health officials then came to the doors of many, many immigrant families in order to take their children away. And many parents resisted this. And though we don't have many photographs of this, but we do know that, for example, one Brooklyn nurse who was involved in identifying children and contacting the health department and getting the children to be sent to hospital, received a warning from the Black Hand, which later became the Mafia, saying, if you report any more babies to the Board of Health, we're going to kill you. I would call that resistance. It was also a very scary moment within the hospitals themselves. Some hospitals were so worried about the contagious nature of the children that they set up glass partitions between their cots and beds. Most of these children ended up being in hospitals for quite a long time, because after the immediate pain of the paralysis, they then had the paralysis to deal with. Now, there were many treatments. New York City, after all, prided itself on being one of the top scientific places in the country. And so you see a whole range of possible treatments. Here, I just wanted to note that convalescent serum, blood plasma, blood from recovered patients who had previously been exposed to polio, was one of the techniques that was used during 1916. Here you see one of the public health physicians withdrawing blood from a donor in order to have the blood made into polio serum. And you also see some of the donors interviewed in the newspaper. Here, the New York Times talks about one man who had a paralyzed arm and leg, who supposedly said to Dr. Zinger, "I've had a tough time of it ever since the disease left me this way as a child. All my life, I felt I had no place in the world. I was left out of everything worthwhile until today. Now, I'm happy because you tell me I'll be able to save some other human being from my fate. If I can do that, I'll feel I haven't wasted my life. This tells you a lot about the experience of people with polio disabilities in this period as well. And the standard rehabilitative treatment, and I can talk about this later if there are any questions, involved usually splinting and casts. So in assessing the epidemic, health officials went back and looked at who got it. And they saw, as you can see here, that it was mainly children who were under 2 years old, and there were very, very few African-American children. They also went back and looked at the cases by race and ethnicity. And what you see here actually is that most of the cases in New York City were native born, were not immigrants as far as New York City could assess it. But this didn't make any difference whatsoever to the understanding of the epidemic itself. Now, I wanted to spend 5 minutes giving you a quick brush up on then what happened with polio. So polio until the 1920s was really seen as a children's disease and as an immigrant disease. But when Franklin Roosevelt, a wealthy lawyer, aspiring politician, became paralyzed by polio, he became a kind of celebrity polio figure. He bought Warm Springs, a health resort in Georgia, and turned it into a polio resort. And other than at Warm Springs, he pretended to the rest of the world that he had conquered polio and that he was not disabled. With the patronage of Roosevelt, he set up a new polio charity called the March of Dimes, which was involved in funding treatment and also scientific research. Here I just wanted to mention that Warm Springs, being in Georgia, was always a segregated resort and never accepted Black patients, right? There were certainly Black faces, as you can see here in the movie theater, but they were the cooks, waiters, and janitors who worked at Warm Springs. And the very first Black March of Dimes poster child didn't appear until 1947. So just to say that polio itself came to be reassessed, and it became clear that it wasn't just a paralyzing disease, that in fact what happened is that the virus spread through the blood and it concentrated primarily in the intestines, and only rarely did it go to the spinal cord and the brain and lead to paralysis. That in fact polio actually has been an endemic disease, was around for many centuries, and it was only with improved childcare and sanitation that you started to see children who were protected from early exposure and then developed paralysis when they got a little bit older. Jonas Salk developed the first polio vaccine, which was tested by the March of Dimes. And it was tested in schools, so that it was tested on both African-American and white children, but they had to enter the schools in separate doors, as you can see here. Enders and his team received a Nobel Prize for their work, while Salk, who was considered sort of a Johnny-come-lately, like he took the insights of Enders and turned it into a vaccine, received the Medal of Honor from President Eisenhower. Albert Sabin, another a New York physician, developed the other OPV, the other polio vaccine, and the March of Dimes decided that it would move from polio and focus on birth defects. And so my last slide just tells you that initially we had a Salk vaccine, and we moved to the Sabin vaccine, which works far more powerfully and provides herd immunity until 2000. And we now are using the Salk vaccine again. All right, thank you.
Oh. Hi, thank you so much. That was great. We have many, many questions. And feel free everyone to keep asking. Okay, so let me see. So we've had a couple of questions for both of you about cost and access to vaccines. I know you touched on that a little, but especially I think for you, Evelyn, was it free at first and then it had to be paid for, or how? I guess, yeah.
So, antitoxin was first produced in the United States at the New York City Health Department. They went out, they bought horses, and so it's produced with horse serum. And so they produced it themselves. So it was pretty much, that was the only place where you could actually get it in New York City. And then also the New York City Health Department taught other health departments how to make it. And so it was distributed free, pretty much. It's a very difficult thing to nail down completely. But again, the political calculus was to make sure that poor kids could get it. And then it's hard to tell how many more other people could get it, but they kept producing it there in the health department. And then the health department began to be able to use whatever revenue they could get from it to support the laboratory work that they were doing to improve it, to figure out other aspects of the use of it. And so it was very much lodged in the city. Right into the early 20th century, though, private enterprises began to say, wait a minute, this is, we need to be able to make money. This is the beginning of Big Pharma, Little Pharma, that became Big Pharma. And they said, this is, the city and the state are taking unfair advantage by keeping control of this, and we need to have a competitive market, and they need to teach us how to do it. And that actually was a very bad thing for the public in New York City, because then those pharmaceutical companies, just one or two at the time, Park Davis and Mumford, began to say, then they want to sell it. They want to sell it for a price. And pretty much after that, the city health department really could not compete with the activities of those two companies. And so they lost control of it. And then it became publicly available for sale. So that's how it happened. And so there was it was a small window when the health department was able to give it away completely free based on their own production of it.
So interesting.
I can just say a word, which is that when the two polio vaccines were developed in the 50s and early 60s, that was the era of big pharma, and there was a widespread awareness that this was absolutely a money-making opportunity, right? Every single family wanted to have their children protected from polio. There was an interesting kind of bifurcation where private physicians, pediatricians in particular, all around the country, were able to order it from different pharmaceutical companies and charge their patients, while public health departments, who, as it were, were in charge of very poor children whom pediatricians didn't treat in the first place, right? So there was a whole nother sort of group of patients, and they provided that for free. So you get a kind of dual vaccination system.
Jean wants to know which company produced the polio vaccines.
I think there were about 4. The most famous company was Cutter, which was a California-based company with a lot of experience in producing vaccines. And the reason it became especially famous is that they had a bad batch that led to about 11 children actually developing polio, right, instead of being protected by it. And there was a brief moment where the entire vaccination program shut down. to find out whether this was something about the whole vaccine or just the Cutter vaccine or just the Cutter batch of the vaccine. And then it was sort of sorted out, and Cutter remained one of the companies.
Wow. And a couple of people, including Stacy, are asking, why are we using the Sulk vaccine?
That's such a good question. So the United States and a number of other countries began by using the Sulk vaccine when it was the only vaccine. And it's a shot. It's usually 3 shots. And it works extremely well and is very safe, but it has no herd immunity, right? It protects only the person that gets infected, gets injected, nobody else. And you have to have enough injections to really build up your immunity. And of course, the shots are not something that any child really enjoys either. So Sulk, the Sabin vaccine, which is an attenuated live virus vaccine. It can be given on a sugar cube or in the drop of a mouth of a baby, so much better access. And also it can spread to the community, usually in its attenuated form, so that in fact the grandparents and the parents and so on, and everybody gets their raised immunity, and it works much better. So that we, like many other countries, switched to using the OPV, the Sabin vaccine, until it became pretty clear that there just was no more wild polio virus in the United States. Now, there is wild polio virus out there in the world, right? Polio is not eradicated, although it's largely eradicated. But the United States and a couple of other countries decided that the risk, there is a risk, a calculated risk, that a certain proportion of people will actually get polio from using the Sabin OPV vaccine. And that's sort of factored into the Vaccine Compensation Acts, right? And that it was just safer to move to a safer, although not quite as potent vaccine. So that's why we did that in 2000.
Thank you. I definitely identify with all of those children who didn't like shots. Let's see. When Kathleen wants to know, when were immunizations required to go to school?
So it varies across the country. So, and New York City was the first where they brought about the mandatory requirements. And it just spreads variously across the country. In New York City by 1930, they had a Diphtheria Prevention Commission, a huge public campaign where they really put little notices in electric bills, in your gas bill, in your water bill, where they just went across the city, and big billboards. If you went to church, you got a notice about getting your kid immunized before school, and then slowly, surely using that to bring it into the mandatory requirement. I can't tell you the data for as it moved across the country, because again, it moves at different times across the country, and also because I can't go to my office and get my books because we're on lockdown, so I can't check. I can send you those figures someday.
I just want to add to what Evelynn just said, that in 1922, there was a major Supreme Court case which ruled that it was legal for states to require that children have vaccinations before they go to school. This was the legal case that was debated in 1922, that disease, as defined as a major problem by the public health department, could be seen as the kind of emergency or disaster that justified enforced vaccination before a child could be admitted to a public school. So public health departments also had the law on their side as well.
But at the same time, as Naomi is right, but it's unevenly implemented even after the case across the country. I grew up in Atlanta, not till way longer than after the decision did they start doing them in the South. And of course in the South, it was done in segregated settings. and all of that. So it was, the case was quote unquote settled, but the implementation went state by state over a fairly long period of time.
Thanks. Okay. Lynn wants to know, before 1905, what were the death and recovery rates for those who contracted diphtheria? Is that also in your office?
Yeah, I think I showed a slide. So, you know, as diphtheria actually had sort of, the people who were studying it at the time could see that it spiked about a 6 to 7 year sort of period where it was endemic in the population, certainly in the Northeast U.S. We know of outbreaks in the 18th century that were absolutely devastating. Upstate New York, Massachusetts, Maine, where an entire village would be hit by it and all the children would die. And that would be a moment where it was very toxic and a very peak period. Then there would be like 6 or 7 years where it seemed not to be as virulent, and then it spike again. And that's something we see characteristically across the 19th century. So I can't tell you those exact numbers for the reason about my office, but and it's not on my slide, but that, so you see that, and that's why people were really surprised at the end of the 19th century. I think it was about 1901. There was a big spike, and they couldn't explain it. Did the bacteria itself, why was it so? Was it different virulence? Was it, what had happened that actually made the bacteria strike so many more people at that time? It was an unsettled question at that particular moment, but it did have this particular pattern. And as I said, the bacilli comes in three strains: a very serious, highly toxic strain, a less toxic, and a mild strain. The issue of the healthy carriers is something that emerged out of diphtheria as well. When people were exposed to some people who had the virulent kind, but they did not develop symptoms. And so an episode I wasn't able to talk about is how the New York City Health Department had to struggle with, should we put healthy carriers on lockdown? Should they be isolated and quarantined just like people who have it? And just like today, there was a huge amount of resistance to that. And because people say, I'm not sick, and I don't, and I'm not, so you can't stop me from going to work. And that was a lot of contestation around that was happening around the time of the court case that Naomi's talking about, because that's some of the issues that people were concerned about. There were healthy carriers, and the healthy did not feel that they needed to be subjected to the same regulations of their behavior as the sick.
Yes, we are certainly dealing with that now. Maybe we'll save that question for later. Naomi, we got a couple of questions asking for more information and clarification about Oyster Bay.
Okay, Oyster Bay was one of a number of towns across Long Island where wealthy families went for the summer. Remember, this is the summer, right? So this was their sort of summer houses. And many families kind of fled central New York City in order to get to their summer houses more quickly, hoping that they would sort of run away from the epidemic. So there was a lot of fear. Remember, this is in the papers every day, right? That this disease would come all the way up to these enclaves. And Oyster Bay is an example of one. I guess we sort of think about it because Theodore Roosevelt was one of the people who had a summer house there also, where the owners of these houses tried to tell the police that in order to protect the wealthy white children, that the police needed to round up any immigrant children who might be around and not so much jail them, but maybe send them back down to Lower Manhattan or wherever they should be, right? So that's sort of part of the Oyster Bay story.
Thanks for that. Okay, a few more questions. Gail wants to know, had the 1916 polio outbreak subsided by the time of the 1918 flu epidemic?
So that was actually something that I was interested in looking at when I did my own work on the 1916 epidemic. Yes, it disappeared by the end of October of 1916. And one of the things I was looking to find is whether there were any sort of lessons that health officials drew or the public drew from the 1916 pandemic when the pandemic hit in 1918. And I just don't find any. I think that there's something about an infectious respiratory disease with a very high mortality rate that really meant that health officials were sort of on their back feet. You know, they tried for quarantine, they tried for increased hygiene, they urged people to wear masks, recognizing that this was a question of nose and throat. But I don't see connection. I was looking for them, and I haven't seeing them. I will say, though, the one thing the pandemic did is that it helped to make the 1916 polio epidemic kind of disappear in people's memory, right? If you're going to think about bad times, you were going to think about influenza and not about polio. But then polio kept returning, right, and kept becoming stronger, more frequent, and more serious, so that you couldn't just, you know, say, oh, it's just one of those older diseases. It really became a modern disease of the 20th century.
Can I ask you a question about that, Naomi? I find this fascinating because, again, like I was saying, you know, when I was writing the diphtheria book, I had an editorial from JAMA, and it said, "Infectious disease studies, a dead specialty." Right? And that was right before, it was published right before AIDS broke out. And there is something about it. There's something about the ways in which these moments become incredibly crisis moments, but there's a kind of forgetting that I struggle with trying to, what is that forgetting about? Don't we think there should be lessons learned, and then we'll, you know, like, for example, you showed data, and I've seen the data in the New York City Health Department reports where everything's broken out by ethnicity and gender and spoken language, and you get all that, and now you can barely get that stuff. And you wonder why. Well,
yeah. I'm really interested in this question of forgetting, and it's something I've been asked, for example, by others during COVID, the last couple of months of COVID. I think that there's been a great deal of forgetting. I think that actually the 1918 pandemic, until just recently, was considered, oh, very terrible, bad thing that a few historians spend their life talking about, but everybody else doesn't really care anymore, right? Because we have a flu vaccine, right? And I think that this is one of the things that actually the polio vaccine helped to create. Not to say that there weren't other scientific instruments of prevention before that, but there was something about that moment of the Salk vaccine, which was seen as a kind of pinnacle of scientific medicine, and a moment where infectious disease would be over, right? This is the conquering moment, all right? This is the moment that would turn physicians' attention away from all those old-fashioned kind of diseases where we had to have infectious disease hospitals, specialty hospitals, and special wards in hospitals, and all of those things on top of the use of penicillin and other things as well would just disappear. We wouldn't need to do that anymore. And it's clear to me when I talk to people who were trained, for example, in the 1970s, that the very the most boring, least respected specialty was infectious disease. The Infectious Disease Society, which still existed in the 70s, used to have 25 people at their national meetings, you know, because like who wanted to do that, you know, and the physicians I've talked to said that they were interested in infectious disease because they cared about the third world. All right, that's where infectious diseases were seen to be about, or maybe like the ghettos in the third world. Other than that, it had nothing to do with modern America.
But the month I finished my dissertation, there was an outbreak of diphtheria in Moscow.
Wow.
And I said, oh my goodness, this can't be real.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I have to say that AIDS really transformed that sense that infectious disease was so yesterday, and that really the only thing America needs to worry about are chronic problems. In no way is this to be heard that I'm saying that chronic problems are not crucial, and indeed AIDS is now a chronic problem as well, right? But it really was a moment where physicians everywhere said, oh my God, there are actually infectious diseases around, including AIDS, and we need to specialize in that as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. All of this. Okay. I've got two and a half more questions. So Gail has asked about Typhoid Mary and super spreaders in general, which a couple of other people have asked about too. And I know that, you know, with COVID, tracing is such an important thing. And so, yeah, I'm curious about that.
What to say about Typhoid Mary, Naomi? Yeah, I mean, you know, because I was our good colleague Judy Levitt has written, you know, a great book on Typhoid Mary. But the typhoid, so typhoid is one of those infectious diseases that was fairly prominent, certainly in the New York area. All three of us are looking at New York, and we knew that there were carriers in various infectious diseases, the asymptomatic people. And what made Typhoid Mary, in my view, and Naomi, you say what you think about it, made it such a case was because of the way in which the public health department, some of the people I write about, who I was shocked to find they were engaged in tracking this poor woman down, the way she was tracked down and the way she was treated and her incarceration. And some of the leaders in the public health establishment thought New York had gone too far by incarcerating her. And there was some dissent. And also looking at the fact that she had not been sick. So she was like, what are you doing? The only thing she knew how to do was be a cook.
Yeah.
But she was also spreading disease because she was a healthy carrier.
Yeah, she's a very interesting example, and Judy Levitt makes the very strong argument that one of the reasons that she was incarcerated, and there were a number of men who were identified as asymptomatic typhoid carriers who were not, and they were just instructed by the health department how to live more healthily and how not to spread the disease, right? So she was an immigrant, and she was a woman. I will say about carriers that polio was one of those diseases that drove health officials and epidemiologists crazy, because there were very often families where one child would be paralyzed and no one else would be. Yeah. So they would, you know, examine them all, and they would talk to them, and they would find out what they'd been eating and drinking and who they'd been talking to, and where they had played, and all of these things. And nothing seemed to explain why it is you had only one case in one family, sometimes only one case in one neighborhood block. And it just drove people absolutely crazy. And you had to have a totally new understanding of polio as an endemic disease that actually everyone has, that everyone has been infected with, and only the very unlucky ones end up being paralyzed. It doesn't mean that everyone else hasn't been exposed. They all have. And it took a long time for people to understand that. But there were many interesting and crazy theories before that time.
They found that some of the doctors, pediatricians who were going from house to house and not changing their clothes, and they were examining kids who were spitting out bacilli all over and stuff all over them, and they go to the next house. They were actually becoming the carriers and spreading. But it was a conundrum, and it was really complicated. And so, and I it's clear that it's still a problem. But I have to say, in Massachusetts, when the governor said, "Oh, with COVID, oh, we don't have a problem because a lot of that's happening in China." I'm thinking, you know how many people in Massachusetts go back and forth to China all the time? What are you thinking? It had to happen that. I mean, it just didn't make any sense to me that he said that.
To me, it raises a really interesting, widespread notion that infectious diseases reflect national boundaries, right? And so I don't know where that idea comes from, but it definitely hasn't disappeared, right? So that if you can identify the country, then you can just say, oh, well, it'll stop at those borders, because somehow the virus will identify that those people are Chinese, but the rest of us are not, or something strange like that. I have to say that I grew up in Australia, and what Australia did to, it's done extremely well in dealing with COVID. It just stopped allowing anyone to come to Australia, anyone. Arguing that, let's try to deal with the community spread we have now, and let's not allow anyone to enter the country before we know what to do with them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Stacy asked about anti-vaccination movements. I was very interested, Evelynn, in what you were saying about the massive public health campaigns for vaccinations, and this seems like a very different moment from that.
Well, it is a very different moment from that. So it's not that when toxin antitoxin was being used for immunizations that there weren't problems. One of the things that was immediately discovered that there was some people had an allergic reaction to it, especially the immunization, the toxin antitoxin that came from horse serum and developed in horses. And that there were people who had reactions to that. And that's when we learned about anaphylactic shock, where you could have severe allergic reactions and die. And so it's not that, and of course that produced fear among people because it wasn't particularly well understood. It's hard to say how actually rare it was, but whenever it happened, say someone got a toxin antitoxin shot and died, it made a huge impression, as it would now, of course. And so that is something that is been a product of the efforts we have to try to ensure safety in vaccines and look for and make sure you do enough so that you possibly understand that you can understand the possible side effects.
And I would also add that when the polio vaccines came out, which, most historians would say was really, a peak moment of public faith in science, and there's no question about that. There was nonetheless a quite significant anti-vaxxer movement. People who argued that the reason that that there were so many polio epidemics is that children were eating too much sugar, too much Coke, too many ice creams. Their nutrition was so poor that their immune system had been hurt. And it's quite an interesting argument. And so the last thing you'd want to do is to give them some kind of vaccine. This was certainly recognized by a number of polio virologists. Many of them got sent pamphlets and letters telling them what a terrible idea, promoting a vaccine was. But it didn't have, it doesn't seem to have had a major public impact, at least in the 50s and 60s. I haven't seen that. I've heard more likely what you had were physicians who were so eager to have the vaccine before it had even finished its clinical trial that they would sort of, borrow it illegally and give it to their family, even though, yes, that was a breach of but that it was such an incredibly desirable thing that everybody wanted.
There's some new books out, and I'm looking forward to where people have gone deeper into this history than I have. I'm looking because I do think there are some significant issues. I think social media has played a different role than it could possibly happen in the past for people's reactions. And I think the successes have, for many people, have outweighed the risk, but it is still a risk-benefit calculus.
Yes. Yeah, and as infectious disease disappear, and until COVID, they were gradually, really profoundly disappearing, you get smaller and smaller numbers of families who really have experienced the impact of, say, measles or other kinds of, of course, this drives pediatricians crazy because they know what it's like, but how can you explain that to a parent who only can respond by saying, I'm worried about the vaccine. I'm not worried about the disease, I'm worried about the vaccine.
Right. And really, because, let's just be really clear here at the end. These diseases are still really serious.
They kill babies. They kill children. Absolutely.
Yeah. Really serious. And it's good to have these kind of conversations because it to remind people of a period when they couldn't count on their kids living past life. Right. You go to old cemeteries here in Boston, and you see lots of young people, lots of children, more than you think you would see. And so we lived in an age where we thought we were in the age where we were free of those kinds of deaths and loss. And, the virus doesn't know anything about that.
No, certainly not. And of course, we're having this conversation because of this pandemic that we're living in now. And so I guess to close out, I wonder if either of you have anything to say about the historical lessons that we have learned, could learn, should have learned, what can connect us from now to then. Any thoughts like that?
Well, if I can jump in first, I do think that COVID is a potent and horrific example of the importance of remembering and the danger of forgetting. I say that partly as a historian and partly as someone living through COVID. I see all around me examples of struggles over the authority and infrastructure of public health departments, debates among scientists over how to design a vaccine, who should regulate the vaccine, how it should be distributed. These shouldn't be brand new questions, all right? These are issues that we have, at least in the 20th, if not the 21st century, dealt with time and again. And so I would just say, let's try to keep remembering.
Well, I can't do that. I think so too. I think the fact that, historians of medicine like Naomi and I get to be called on now from, news organizations around the world to remind people of things that have been forgotten is a kind of scary thing, because it's true. We have been here before. Humankind has been in this engagement with infectious disease for millennia. And we have learned some things, and how to make the remembering and the lessons we need to learn more visible, more accessible when these things happen, when the outbreaks happen. I don't have an answer for that. I wish there was, because I sat in January with a whole sense of dread. I was like, oh my goodness, it's gonna be here soon. Airplanes, it's just gonna be here, and what are we gonna do? And it's, for those of us who have all this arcane knowledge, with things arcane, but now we realize it is relevant and it is important. And so how we manage that, I think humans don't like to hold on to those kinds of things, but I think governments and leaders have to. So I do think, and certainly physicians and public health. And so I think there are lots of lessons to be learned about. If the public can't remember, our leaders have to remember.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm very, very grateful for your time and your knowledge. And I want to thank everyone for being here with us this evening, and you know, remembering the things that are so important to remember. So I'm very grateful. And also I got my flu shot today, so don't forget, everybody. Yeah, so thank you, and have a good night, everyone. Take good care.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.